Hi, I'm Cate. I have recently completed some research at Deakin University on the Australian civil-military relationship. To find the cultural characteristics of that relationship, I examined over 500 documents in the public domain, including lots of images. This presentation is about the importance of images in the way Australians understand the military figure. Australia constructs its identity in part from popular culture, and the military figure is situated well in Australian art, literature, film and television. These images contribute to the construction and promotion of the military ideal, known as the digger, in the Australian vernacular. The popular presentation of Australia's participation in various wars throughout the 20th and 21st century set the scene for the cultivation of the digger. The digger is a term drawn from the pioneering stories of 19th century Australian settlers digging for gold, digging the soil for agriculture and so on, and suggests hardship, innovation and guts. Created and recreated images of Australians at war lay the foundations of this idea of the digger and layer more characteristics on him as the setting changes. The South African War, at the very beginning of the 20th century, is largely represented in Australian popular culture by Bruce Beresford's 1980 film Breaker Morant. Harry Morant, although an officer and a war criminal, is depicted as a folk hero and something of a martyr through his independence and defiance of British rule. This characterisation is galvanised at his execution with the defiant cry, "Shoot straight, you bastards." The larrikin pair of diggers, Frank and Archie, in Peter Weir's film Gallipoli, are firmly established in the public eye as images of World War I. Despite coming from the opposite environments of bush and city, the diggers are united in their self-determination and suspicion of British authority. World War II gives us the evocative paintings of Sidney Nolan, Albert Tucker and the Melbourne artists. Randolph Stowe's novel The Merry-Go-Round in the Sea and George Johnson's My Brother Jack start to build on this image of the digger who is transformed and affected by war. This extract from Johnson's book illustrates this image well. What had changed about him, I began to realise, was both subtle and profound. It was almost as if he had been fined down to the essential Jack, as if this was what my brother really should look like, as if all his growing and maturing had been working towards the presentation of this man in this exact appearance at this precise time. Even more than this, for I saw that this was not only that he looked as Jack should look, but he looked as a proper man should look. The Vietnam War is depicted not in Rambo-like horror, but in the comedy of Tom Jeffries' film The Odd Angry Shot. The digger prevails as an anti-authoritarian figure, but this time towards his own commanders. The association with Australian peacekeeping is remembered by this poster celebrating 50 years of the United Nations, with a photo taken by George Gittos. Here the digger has become ambassador, teacher, peacekeeper and soldier. And Afghanistan brings to mind a harsh desert environment and special forces soldiers. The digger is now fully professional, but still presented as brave, intuitive and resilient. When we think about how we perceive the military, it's useful to consider the two concepts of identity and mobility. The first concept, identity, describes the two labels of military and non-military, which military people call civilian. These identities can present in dual or binary form. The dual form of military-civilian identity is present when individuals identify or are identified by others as being both military and civilian at the same time. The binary form is present when individuals identify as either military or civilian. The existence of the labels military and civilian comes from an assumption of civil-military relations theory in which there is an organisational separation between what is military and what is not. That separation creates a culture which is studied as other, although those within it are still part of the wider society that created it. The second concept, mobility, says that if the military-civilian identity is binary, then an individual must make a professional and social move from being a civilian to being military and vice versa. This movement can, for instance, describe the enlistment and discharge process through which Australian citizens can move between the two identities. That is, be civilians and then members of the ADF and then civilians again at different times of their life. Thus, mobility refers to the fluidity of the micro-level identities within the Australian civil-military relationship. What is also useful for understanding military identity is academic theory, and we can draw relevant theoretical perspectives from all sorts of disciplines. For instance, sociology helps position the institution of the armed forces both in and outside society by introducing the notion of constructed identities. Political science provides social contract theory, which is useful for explaining how the public has a vested interest in the military. Psychology offers social identity theory, which explains how groups define themselves, and anthropology offers ethnographic methodology as a valid way to study human culture. Civil-military relations theory specifically has its foundations in the work of Samuel Huntington and Maurice Janowitz. Huntington gives us the ideas around professionalism of the military and the principle of civil control. He also gives us the functional and societal imperatives, what the military must do to achieve the objective versus what it must do to represent society. On the other hand, Janowitz gives us convergence theory and the constabulary role of the military, which explains how the military and civil sectors can start to merge and resemble each other. Charles Moskos gives us the institutional occupational thesis, which determines whether the military looks and behaves more like an institution or an occupation. Critical civil-military relations theory departs from these normative principles of civil control and professional orientation by analysing militarism and militarisation through such perspectives as human geography, feminism, gender and environment, and reflexivity, and explores such topics as warrior identity, sexuality, memorials, the human body, and death. My research looked at 3 case studies: the Contemporary Victoria Cross Awards, combat deaths in Afghanistan, and the centenary of Anzac. I identified that there's a gap in understanding between civil and military sectors about the culture and role of the modern Australian military. Since civil-military interactions are limited, we can get some clues in high-profile events in which the Australian Defence Force and Australian communities come together. The dominant images promoted during these events provide some insight into the way military members perceive themselves and are perceived by others. The Victoria Cross discourse presented conflicting images of the military figure as both warrior, portrayed as the superhero, and ordinary man, helping, humble, generous, and caring. These images are presented to the public simultaneously, so it confounds the image of the military figure as familiar and unfamiliar at the same time, or someone who is recognisable and relatable, but also alien. The combat death discourse gives us images of ceremony, gravity, and family. Deaths of soldiers are surrounded with reverence and ritual, and family members are remembered in public images of mourning. These are practices and settings that are in decline in much of Australian community life. This is organisational behaviour, group membership, and it communicates a message that military members are part of something bigger than themselves. In this case, part of the nation. The centenary of Anzac, commemorated between 2014 and 2018, presented images not of the contemporary military figure, but the historical citizen soldier. The predominant images, however, were about the concept of Anzac. rather than memorialising the 100th anniversary of the Great War, as the UK, France and Canada did, the Australian message was the perpetuity of the Anzac brand. The spirit lives. As it was during the First World War, the Anzac brand was once again commodified and commercialised. Images of reenactment and localisation became the focus, and contemporary ADF members were located against this historical context to lend some sense of the spirit living on. But the documenting of the commemoration was dominated by social events and images of battlefield tourism, in which a somewhat disassociated generation made pilgrimages to First World War battlegrounds and war graves to experience a connection with history. But the result was an exported patriotism rather than a connection to the military. The dominant image of the Australian military figure prevails as the digger. He is white, he is an outdoorsman, he is a larrikin, he's an amateur, he is a he. He questions authority, he flouts the rules, he is fiercely loyal, bold, selfless and brave. The digger represents a status greater than the individual and one that is potentially unattainable, a description of ethereal mystery. This image is often used as a symbol of national identity. However, as that symbol is reflected back onto the Australian Defence Force, the leaders and members of that organisation often interpret those qualities as part of community expectation and feel obliged to demonstrate them. But how accurate is it? The organisation today, since 1973, is the all-volunteer force, but don't confuse volunteer with amateur. The reasons people joined the Australian Defence Force are still the same: national service, family ties, adventure, personal growth and altruism. But the military member looks quite different today. They are highly skilled, educated and demographically diverse. But the point is, it doesn't matter how far from this image the military member has come, this is the preferred image in the national vernacular. My research talks about these case studies in reference to military identity and mobility, and finds that the Australian civil-military relationship is influenced by a network of social connections that connect the contemporary military figure with historic, regular, reserve, state and local communities, and allows for multiple interpretations of military service. Images play an important part in the way Australians understand the military figure. I wonder how they influence the way you think about the military. If you would like to read more about the Australian civil-military relationship, click on the link below to access my work. I'm Cate Carter, and this is my research.